Hi everyone, thanks for visiting my channel. If you are new here, welcome. I'm Carol, the Thrifty Chic Housewife. Today we're going to do some canning. It is gloomy outside and I think it's a wonderful day to warm up the kitchen with our canner. So what we're going to do is we are going to can up Mississippi pot roast in a jar. Now I know people are crazy about Mississippi pot roast. I have a video on Mississippi pot roast and it has a lot of views on it in comparison to some of my other videos. So I thought, why not do this in a canning version? So there really are no quote unquote tested recipes for Mississippi pot roast. But in the all new Ball Book of Canning, they have a section called Simple One Jar Meals. And in that they have pot roast in a jar. So I took some of their methods for doing the pot roast in a jar, and I'm going to apply it to making Mississippi pot roast in a jar. So Mississippi pot roast, we cannot can that like you would normally make Mississippi pot roast. It includes butter, which we can't can because it's dairy. It also includes the seasoning packets, a ranch seasoning packet, and either au jus gravy or brown gravy. And we can't use either one of these. The ranch packet has dairy in it, has buttermilk in it, has dairy, so we can't can with that. And it also has thickeners in it, and the gravy packet also has thickeners. So we cannot use these, but we can still get the same flavor profile, which is what I'm going for with this recipe. And so I kind of did some research on what seasonings are in ranch dressing. So we're gonna use those flavors to still get the flavor without using the original seasoning packets. So what I came up with for as far as seasoning is I made my own seasoning. I took 2 tablespoons of dried parsley, 2 tablespoons of minced dried onion, 2 teaspoons of dried dill, 1 teaspoon of garlic powder, 1 teaspoon of onion powder, and a teaspoon of pepper. And mixed it all together. That's going to be our seasoning blend for the ranch part. I didn't add any salt because for the broth part, I'm going to be using Better Than Bouillon beef base. You guys, this stuff is so great to have in your kitchen for a multitude of reasons. It really enhances the flavor of a lot of dishes, but we're going to use this instead of beef broth. You could totally use beef broth instead if you want to, but this is going to lend us extra flavor. I dissolved, it says for 1 bouillon cube, it's 1 teaspoon of the Better Than Bouillon. I used about 1.5 teaspoons per cup of water so that I could have a richer flavor. Also to my broth mixture, I added 2 teaspoons of kitchen Bouquet. And I know that this is safe for canning because Ball uses it in another recipe for canning beef and wine sauce, I think it's called. They use this. So I know that I can safely use this. So so that's what I'm going to use as my broth base. Now, just a word on canning your own recipes. When you do that, you have to, I always try to find a similar recipe and use it as my guide. That's the reason for me using the Ball recipe for pot roast in a jar. I always use that as my guide. You always want to make sure that whatever you're putting in your jars is every single ingredient is safe for canning. And as far as your canning times go, you want to can it for the longest time for whatever ingredients you are including. So, for example, carrots are at a different time than beef. So if you were combining those two things, you would can it for the longer time, which would be the time for beef. So if that makes sense. So you can can up your own recipes. You just want to make sure everything is safe for canning and you're following all safe canning guidelines. And I am. I've confirmed that everything I'm putting in my jars is safe for canning, and I'm also using a tested recipe as my guide and for the time that I'm going to be using. So I know you're thinking in your mind, Mississippi pot roast has butter in it, which we already talked about. We cannot include and still be safe for canning. So where does that factor come in? Well, what we're gonna do, my idea for that is to add your butter, and we're gonna add some flour also after the fact when we open our jars. So we'll still have that Mississippi pot roast flavor. We just don't have to put everything in the jar. There are some things that when you're canning, sometimes you have to do after the fact. Thickening is one of them, and if you want to add any dairy, that has to be done after the fact as well. And as a matter of fact, the pot roast in a jar that's in the Ball Canning book, they recommend thickening this recipe with 2 tablespoons of flour for quart jars, 1 tablespoon of flour for pint jars. So what we're gonna do is when we open a jar of the Mississippi pot roast in a jar, I'm gonna be canning in pints, so I'm just going to add a tablespoon of butter and a tablespoon of flour. Now, in the original Mississippi pot roast recipe, it calls for, in my opinion, a lot of butter. I don't ever put as much butter in my Mississippi pot roast as is called for in the original recipe. So the butter is going to be up to your discretion, but I would think up to a tablespoon per pint jar would be more than enough. If you wanted to add less, you could add less. If you want to add more, add more. So it's kind of up to your discretion. I was just trying to keep it simple and using the 1 tablespoon of flour and 1 tablespoon of butter, and we'll do that when we open our jars after the canning process. So, are you still with me? I hope so. I think this is going to be a really delicious recipe, and I think it's going to be great to have on your shelf. I have 2 inches, actually 3 inches of simmering water in my pressure canner. Beef, any kind of meat is a low acid food and must be pressure canned. So I have 2 to 3 inches of simmering water in my canner ready to go. I did my beef broth. Like I already said, I used the Better Than Bouillon, added a little bit of the kitchen Bouquet. And then for my beef, I have just over 4 pounds of chuck roast that I have cut into about 1-inch cubes, which is what is recommended for the pot roast in a jar recipe by Ball. I did take off quite a bit of the fat. So that's up to you. I don't want a ton of fat in my jars. So I trimmed all that off, which I would recommend you doing anyway. Fat can be an issue when canning, so I would recommend trimming off any excess fat and then cut your roast in cubes. And then of course, the one ingredient that also makes it Mississippi pot roast are the pepperoncinis. So we're just gonna add 1 pepper to each jar. That's also up to you. If you really like that flavor and you want a lot of it, you could add up to 2 peppers. If they're too hot for you or too spicy, or you don't want all of that in your jars, you could cut your peppers in half or in quarters to add however much flavor you want to add. I think the original recipe for like a 2 to 3 pound roast, when you're making the original pot roast, is like 3 to 4 peppers. I always add more because we enjoy that flavor. So for today, I'm going to be adding 1 pepper per jar. But like I said, that's entirely up to you how Mississippi you want to make your Mississippi pot roast. So again, we're ready to get started. Modern canning guidelines state that you do not need to pre-sterilize lids and jars as long as you're canning for more than 10 minutes. We're going to be canning in pint jars, so we're going to be processing for 75 minutes. If we are going to pack our jars with our beef, add a pepper, add our seasoning, and then top it off with broth, and always debubble. So here we go. You want to make sure that you've washed your jars thoroughly and you want to keep them hot. So I wash mine and just keep them hot in my sink. You can do that however you prefer to do it. I know a lot of people use their dishwasher. My dishwasher is always busy with other things, so I don't use my dishwasher. But anyway, so we're going to start with 2 hot jars. One more thing before we get started. In the Ball canning book for their pot roast in a jar recipe, that recipe also includes carrots, celery, and onion, the traditional things that you would add to pot roast. I'm not going to add the veggies because I just want the meat, so I'll be able to get more meat in my jars. However, I will leave you the information as to amounts that they recommend. I think they go for 2 pounds. Their recipe is 2 pounds of beef. So I will make sure that I put in the description box what the amounts are if you want to add carrots and potatoes and onions and celery. I think it is those 4 things. So anyway, back to our jars. Fill our jars with meat, and we are looking for 1-inch headspace. Make sure you leave room for your pepper. So now we're going to add 1 pepper. If you wanted to, you could go ahead and remove the stem. I'm just going to leave mine on. That's what I do when I make regular Mississippi pot roast. And then I'm going to add a heaping teaspoon of my seasoning blend. And again, this is to taste, so you could add more if you want to, or you could add less. And I'm right about my 1-inch headspace, so I'm going to go ahead and add broth again to the 1-inch headspace. And then we are going to debubble. I'm going to use a debubbling tool, but if you do not have one, you can use a chopstick. You could use a plastic knife. Just don't use anything metal to debubble. So we just want to release any air bubbles. Just kind of poke around your jar. And sometimes when you debubble, after you debubble, you can add more liquid. So I'm going to top this off to make sure that I'm at my 1-inch headspace. And then I'm going to take a paper towel dipped in white vinegar and wipe my rims. You want to make sure your rims are nice and clean so that nothing interferes with our seal. My lids I also washed. They do not have to be boiled, or at least the ball lids don't. If you're using other lids, make sure you use whatever instructions are included for those lids. And then we're going to add our bands to fingertip tight. Now I know that several of the canning books and even the Ball Blue Book of canning, when they talk about canning meat, they usually brown it or par cook it some. This recipe from Ball, their instructions were there. It did not include instructions for pre-cooking your meat. That's why I'm just putting it in raw. I'm raw packing it. So if there was any question about that, that's why. I got about 6 jars, 6-pint jars out of the meat that I had. So now what I do is I add the vinegar that I used to dip my cloth in, my paper towel in to clean the rims. I take the rest of it and I put it in my water. The reason I do that is because we have deposits, mineral deposits or minerals in our water that like to collect on our jars when we can. If you add a couple of tablespoons of vinegar to your canner prior to canning, it doesn't do that. So that's why I do that. And now we're going to add our lid. I'm using the All-American canner. And you want to make sure you line up your notch with your arrow. Make sure your lid is fairly level. Oops. And then you're going to tighten your thumb screws 2 at a time, opposites. Okay, I'm going to crank up my heat to high, and we are going to get things going up to temperature. We want our vent, you want to see steam pouring out of your vent for 10 minutes before we can put our weight on. Okay guys, I vented for 10 minutes. I let the steam pour out of my vent just like this for 10 minutes. So now we're ready to apply the weight. Like I said, I'm going to be using 10 pounds of pressure. So I'm going to add my weight. We are going to bring our canner up to temperature. I have a dual gauge canner, so I also have a temperature gauge. It'll be 240 degrees, and at that point, my weight will start rocking and rolling, and we can start timing. So just make sure that you know your altitude so that you know how many pounds of pressure to be canning at and what adjustments you need to make for your altitude. Okay guys, our weight is rocking and rolling, so now it's time to start timing. So I'm going to set my timer for 75 minutes. That's for pint jars. If you're doing quart jars, you want 90 minutes. And when we're all done, I'll bring you back. One more thing before I go. We had our heat cranked all the way up to get it up to temperature. So now you want to make sure you adjust your heat so that your weight rocks 1 to 3 times a minute. You do not want it constantly rocking like that. That means your heat is too high. So we want to turn our heat down. For me, that means turning my heat down to about a medium heat. And then my weight will rock 1 to 3 times a minute. You'll just have to experiment with your stove and see where you need to be. Just make sure you listen for it 1 to 3 times a minute and you're good. Okay guys, our processing time is up, so I'm going to turn my heat off. We're going to let our canner return to 0 pressure naturally, and at that point then we can remove our weight. Then we will wait about 5 minutes and then we'll remove the lid. And then we will let our jars sit in the canner to cool a little bit for about 10 minutes, and then we can take them out of our canner and see our delicious pot roast. Okay guys, we are all done. Once my canner returned to 0 pressure, I went ahead and removed my weight. I waited 5 minutes and then took off the lid, and my jars have been sitting in my canner for just over 10 minutes. So now we can see our delicious pot roast. Give you a close-up. Mississippi pot roast in a jar. So simple. So now what you want to do is you want to let your jars cool undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours, and then you want to remove the rings, wash your jars and label them and store them in a cool, dark place. But what I'm going to do is once my jars have cooled enough, I'm going to bring you back and I'm going to show you how to do the rest of the Mississippi part of the Mississippi pot roast. We're going to add a tablespoon of butter, and we're also going to add a tablespoon of flour to thicken up our broth so we have the delicious gravy. Okay guys, well it's been a few days since we canned up our delicious Mississippi pot roast in a jar. So today I was going to show you how I would thicken it and add our butter. I'm going to use butter and flour, which were the 2 things that we could not include in our jar. So I'm going to show you how I would thicken it, how I would do it. We talked about earlier in the video, I was going to use 1 tablespoon of flour and 1 tablespoon of butter, and we're going to thicken it up and finish off making it Mississippi pot roast. Okay guys, so what do you think? Pretty easy? Yeah, I think so. All I did was put in a tablespoon of butter and my tablespoon of flour, mixed them together in my pan, poured in the contents of my Mississippi pot roast from my jar, and simmered it for about 5 minutes, and I think it turned out beautiful. I'll give you another close-up here. It looks just delicious, and the gravy turned out great. If you want yours a little bit thicker, this is pretty much the consistency it would be if you made regular Mississippi pot roast in your crock pot. The consistency is still the same, but since you are thickening it after the fact, if you want a thicker gravy, you could add another tablespoon of flour, I think would be fine. You could add more butter if you like yours real buttery. Like I said, I decrease the amount of butter when I make regular Mississippi pot roast, so I just use the 1 tablespoon for my pint jar. So that's up to you, but I think that it is just your pot roast is just absolutely fork tender, and it smells amazing. And so let's give it a taste. Perfect. The seasonings are spot on. It tastes just like making Mississippi pot roast in your crock pot, but we have it in a jar so that it's ready to cook. All we have to do is pop open a jar, add our flour and butter, and we have instant Mississippi pot roast. And I think this is great. So I hope you guys will give this a try. An alternate way to thicken it is you can take a tablespoon or 2 of room temperature butter, add your tablespoon or 2 of flour to the room temperature butter, and mix that together, and then just stir it in the contents of your jar and bring it to a simmer that way. You don't have to technically do what I did, which was basically make a roux. You don't have to do it that way. The flour will melt right into your room temperature butter and you won't have any lumps or anything. So that's an alternate way to do that. So I hope that you will give this recipe a try. This was a lot of fun to do, to kind of think outside the box. And sometimes you have to do that with canning if there are things that you want to try, but it includes ingredients that you can't can. Sometimes you just have to think outside the box, get the main product that you're wanting in your jar, and maybe do a little tweaking after you open it. So anyway, thanks so much for coming along with me, guys. As always, if you have any comments or questions, please leave them for me in the comment section. Like, subscribe, and share, and I will see you next time. Have a great day.